There seems to be a lot of strong opinions about the brand Invicta, but I think we're all going to be okay agreeing that in this case, for the watch that I'm going to show you today, we can probably put those opinions aside. Hello, you're watching James. My name's James, you're watching me, and I am talking about watches. And I think the reason we can put this idea of the brand aside is because of the design of this watch and the unique feature of this watch, because this is not only just a watch, but it is also an on-wrist pinball game. A pinball game that you can actually use. And for me that works in quite well because I quite like interesting and fun watches, but it also works because I've always actually wanted to get hands-on with an Invicta. I've wanted to understand whether or not these watches are just a gimmick, or are they actually well made? Are they a watch that we should be considering purchasing, or should we completely shun them like some people tend to do? But for this one, I'm not even sure if it is the right Invicta to purchase to try and make that decision, because I really bought this one because of that fun pinball game. But what I want to try and figure out whilst I own this one is whether or not it is just a novelty. Did I buy it just because it's fun, or is it actually a good watch? I've only had this watch a couple of days now, so I thought I might just share with you some things that have stood out to me, because a couple of things that I was not expecting have definitely stood out to me. So let me show you a few things that have stood out to me. So although I bought this Invicta watch more because of this particular style, it has actually been quite good to get hands-on with an Invicta watch itself. And it came in the iconic yellow Invicta box. But when this watch, I have to say, there were 4 things that really stood out to me as soon as I opened it. And the first thing was not the price, or at least not the super discount, because I did not pay that. Obviously Invicta watches, one of their sort of sales techniques is to say that they're super expensive and then give you a huge discount. But because I knew that is one of the techniques that they used, that didn't end up actually standing out to me. I actually paid around $300, whereas this one listed as $1,195. But the first thing that actually stood out to me is the quality of this watch. I wasn't sure of what my expectations were going to be of this watch, but perhaps because of some negativity spoken about the brand, perhaps I was expecting it to feel cheap, and it does not feel cheap. Really nice brushing on the top of the case, a really nice polishing on the sides, and a nice case design too. Really feels nice, and if it wasn't for the next feature, I still would have thought that it was a well-made watch, but it is the details within the pinball game. When you look really closely, even under high magnification, it is actually quite scary how good that is. I expected this sort of part of the watch to be perhaps a little bit of a novelty, so I didn't have any high expectations for it, but that has been made very well. But something that I was somewhat expecting but hoping that it wouldn't be, but it certainly has occurred and it certainly has stood out to me, is the size, because the lug to lug of this watch is 60 millimeters. And that is pushing past the boundaries of my wrist, which is unfortunate because it means that this watch, no matter how much I end up liking it or even disliking it, it will end up leaving the collection because it's just too big for me. And that is unfortunate, because the next thing that stood out to me still relates to the quality, and it is the quality of the strap. You can see that is a lug width of 26 millimeters, so it is a large watch, but I did not expect this also to be so well made. It has that crocodile style leather, very soft underneath, and really good hardware too. Really starting to feel like it's a shame that it is quite this large. And I have to admit, I did think the pinball element of this one might just end up being an interesting, fun visual element. But nope, the thing that stood out to me is that it is actually a usable pinball game. But beyond those 4 things, as I look deeper into this watch, as I get to know this watch, and as I'll get to know it over the next few months prior to end up selling it, I do see some other elements. That ball bearing that is used as the ball, well, it seems to have been replicated here as the hour markers on the dial of the face of the watch itself. So it links the watch to the game, which I think is quite nice, because it would have been quite easy to have a fun game and then to stick a quartz watch on there, but they've actually linked them together. I'm not sure if I love how they look as their hour markers, but I do appreciate the linked elements between the 2 parts of the watch. As I mentioned, it's just a quartz movement in there. I'm not sure which quartz movement they're using, and there's no second hand. But there's some nice interesting details on the case back as well, talking about the watch. And I'm assuming because you start using the action of this here, that they've put the crown on the left-hand side of the watch. And you'll probably notice that it's rather large. You can see it actually hangs over my wrist. What it does show though, for 60mm, which is effectively huge, it doesn't look completely stupid on my wrist. Okay, it's too big for me, and I know that it is too big for me, which is probably why it won't end up staying in my collection long term. But it's not like it's sitting like that off my wrist. It's just overhanging a little bit. I think it's actually a good watch to use an example as the idea of lug to lug, because for a very long time I thought lug to lug had to be under 48mm. And look at 60mm. That's pushing past the boundaries, but that's a lot bigger than 48. I might have to talk about lug to lug measurements again in a future video. So keep an eye out for that video and a more in-depth full review of this one before I end up selling it. But whilst we wait for that, maybe watch these two videos next.